close your eyes and let your mind drift across the vast expanse of time, where ancient mountain winds still whisper stories of kingdoms that once stretched from sea to shining sea. Tonight we journey together into the world of Tigranes the Great, a ruler whose empire rivaled Rome itself, yet whose name has been carried more by mountain breezes than by the loud proclamations of history books. Picture, if you will, the Armenian highlands at the moment when day surrenders to twilight. Those eternal peaks standing sentinel over valleys where shepherds still guide their flocks along paths once travelled by royal messengers bearing decrees to distant provinces. Here, in this land where eagles soar above ancient trade routes, we discover a story that unfolds like the slow revelation of stars emerging in a darkening sky. This is not merely a tale of conquest and empire, but a meditation on the eternal rhythms of rise and fall, of human ambition reaching toward the heavens, only to find its proper place within the greater tapestry of time. As you settle into comfortable rest, allow this ancient story to carry you gently towards sleep, knowing that in understanding the impermanence of even the mightiest kingdoms, we find perspective for our own daily concerns. If this journey through time brings you comfort, please consider sharing it with others who seek the same peaceful refuge from our modern world's constant motion. Leave a comment about which period of ancient history speaks most deeply to your soul, for we are all fellow travelers seeking wisdom in the stories of those who came before us. Now, let us begin where all great stories must, in the timeless landscape that shaped both empire and emperor, in those sacred mountains where the very stones remember the footsteps of kings. In the beginning, before kings claimed dominion or armies crossed mountain passes, there existed a land that seemed designed by Providence itself to nurture both sanctuary and crossroads. The Armenian highlands rise from the earth like the backbone of creation, their snow-crowned peaks catching the first light of dawn and holding the last gold of evening in their eternal embrace. Here, where the world's great rivers are born from mountain springs, the Euphrates and the Tigris begin their ancient journey toward distant seas, carrying with them the snowmelt and the dreams of highland peoples. The air itself tells stories in this realm, thin and sharp at the peaks, sweet with the scent of alpine flowers in the meadows, rich with the promise of grain in the valleys where volcanic soil has nurtured abundance for countless generations. This is geography as destiny, landscape as character. The Armenian highlands created a people who understood both isolation and connection, who could retreat into mountain fortresses when threatened, yet emerged to participate in the grand commerce of the ancient world when opportunity beckoned. The same peaks that provided protection also demanded strength. The same valleys that offered sustenance also required wisdom to cultivate and defend. Imagine yourself standing on one of these ancient heights, feeling the wind that has blown unchanged for millennia, watching the sunrise paint the distant ranges in shades of rose and gold. Below, you spread the fertile valleys where Armenian farmers first learned to coax abundance from highland soil, where smiths discovered the secrets of working the iron and copper hidden in mountain veins, where traders calculated the value of goods that would travel from China to Rome along routes that converged like destiny in these highland markets. The minerals embedded in these mountains, copper gleaming like captured sunlight, iron strong as mountain stone, silver bright as winter morning, would become the foundation not merely of wealth but of power. For in the ancient world, those who controlled the sources of metal controlled the tools of both peace and war, the plowshares that fed empires and the swords that defended them. Yet perhaps most importantly, this landscape taught its people the art of adaptation. Seasons here are not gentle transitions, but dramatic transformations. Winter snows that bury the world in pristine silence, spring floods that remake the very geography of valleys, summers that blaze with the intensity of contained fire, autumns that paint the mountains in colours so vivid they seem to burn against the clear highland sky. The Armenian people learned to read these rhythms, to prepare for abundance and scarcity with equal wisdom, to understand that change is the only constant, and that survival belongs to those who can bend without breaking. These lessons, learned in the patient relationship between highland farmers and their demanding landscape, would later serve kings who needed to govern territories spanning multiple climates and countless different peoples. In the evening, when the last light lingers on the peaks long after the valleys have surrendered to shadow, you can almost hear the echo of ancient voices, traders calling their wares in half a dozen languages, children learning the old stories that connected them to both mountain and sky, elders sharing the accumulated wisdom that would eventually guide the steps of kings. This land did not merely witness history, it shaped history, creating conditions that would nurture leaders capable of thinking beyond tribal boundaries, while never forgetting the mountain wisdom that strength comes from roots growing deep in ancestral soil. Every great story begins in the mists, where history and legend intertwine like lovers' hands, where the facts recorded by scribes meet the deeper truths preserved in the songs of grandmothers. The Armenian royal lineage emerges from such mists, carrying with it the weight of divine favor and the promise of destinies yet to unfold. In the swirling aftermath of Alexander's conquests, when his vast empire fragmented like a shattered vessel, each piece reflecting something of the original brilliance, the Armenian highlands witnessed the birth of something unprecedented. Around 190 BCE, in the wake of Seleucid decline, a leader named Artaxiad emerged to claim not merely territory but destiny itself. Artaxiad I, whose name would echo through generations like a song of power and purpose, understood something that many conquerors failed to grasp, that true kingship flows not from the sword alone, but from the delicate alchemy of force and consent, tradition and innovation, local wisdom and international sophistication. He founded what would become known as the Artaxiad dynasty, establishing a bloodline that would reach its ultimate flowering in his descendant, Tigranes the Great. The legends surrounding this founding speak of divine signs and prophetic dreams, of eagles circling above the ceremonies that proclaimed the new kingdom, of mountain springs flowing with unusual clarity on the day the first crown touched the first Artaxiad brow, and Bast in Artaxiad brow. Whether literal truth or metaphorical wisdom, these stories served a purpose deeper than mere historical record. They provided the psychological foundation upon which later generations would build achievements that surpassed all reasonable expectation. Picture the patient work of those early years as Artaxiad and his successors wove the scattered Armenian communities into something approaching political unity. This was not the dramatic conquest of romantic imagination, but the careful, methodical work of diplomacy and compromise, marriage alliance and military demonstration, economic incentive and cultural respect. Valley by valley, clan by clan, the Artaxiad realm expanded like morning light creeping down mountain slopes. The royal court of these early Artaxiad kings would have been a remarkable synthesis of influences: Armenian clan traditions preserved in ceremony and law, Hellenistic learning imported by scholars who had studied in Alexandria and Athens, Persian administrative techniques adapted to highland conditions, local religious practices enhanced by philosophical sophistication. Imagine the conversations that must have taken place in those mountain halls as advisors debated policy in multiple languages while scribes recorded decisions that would echo through centuries. Yet beneath the political maneuvering and cultural synthesis lay something more fundamental: the gradual emergence of Armenian identity as something distinct from both Greek sophistication and Persian grandeur. The Artaxiad rulers were creating not merely a kingdom but a people, fostering the growth of shared language, shared stories, shared dreams that would prove more durable than any fortress walls. In the quiet hours before dawn, when even kings must confront their mortality, the early Artaxiad rulers must have wondered whether their careful work would endure, whether the kingdom they were building would survive the inevitable tests of time and circumstance. They could not have imagined that their patient labours were preparing the foundation for an empire that would challenge Rome itself, that in their bloodline grew the seed of greatness that would astonish the ancient world. The legends speak of destinies written in stars and promises whispered by mountain winds. But perhaps the deeper truth lies in the accumulated choices of men and women who understood that greatness grows slowly, like mighty trees that sink their roots deep before they dare reach toward the sky. In this understanding, we glimpse the first stirrings of the wisdom that would eventually guide Tigranes toward achievements that transformed the very meaning of Armenian identity. In the mountain palace where legends walked the halls like honored guests, and the future waited with the patience of stone, a prince came of age who would redefine the possible. Tigranes, his name meaning gift of the tiger god, grew to manhood in an environment that demanded both intellectual sophistication and warrior courage, where a future king must learn to speak the language of philosophers and the dialect of battlefield commands with equal fluency. Imagine the young prince in the early morning hours when the mountain air carries the crystal clarity that sharpens both sight and thought, receiving instruction from tutors who represented the accumulated wisdom of the ancient world. Here, perhaps, a Greek scholar explaining the mathematical principles that governed both architecture and astronomy, there a Persian administrator demonstrating the delicate art of managing tribute systems that must seem reasonable to subject peoples while remaining profitable to imperial needs. The education of a future king of kings required mastery of contradictions that would have overwhelmed lesser minds. Tigranes learned to appreciate Greek poetry while understanding the practical necessity of Armenian clan loyalties, to admire Persian court ceremonies while maintaining the straightforward honesty that mountain peoples demanded from their leaders. He studied the campaigns of Alexander, while absorbing the patient wisdom of Highlanders, who knew that true conquest comes not from dramatic victories, but from the ability to hold what has been won. In the weapons courtyard, as afternoon shadows lengthened across ancient stones, the young prince practiced not merely the physical skills of warfare, but the psychological disciplines that transform individual courage into collective confidence. His instructors would have been veterans of numerous campaigns, men who understood that a king's valor on the battlefield serves primarily to inspire the bravery of thousands who follow his banner. Every sword stroke, every tactical exercise, every discussion of military strategy was simultaneously preparation for personal combat and education in the art of leadership under the ultimate stress. Yet perhaps the most crucial aspect of Tigranes' formation occurred in the evening hours, when royal business demanded his presence at councils where the day-to-day governance of the kingdom unfolded in all its complex detail. Here, he learned to listen to the complaints of merchants whose trade routes had been disrupted by tribal conflicts, to weigh the requests of local governors seeking resources for infrastructure projects, to balance the competing claims of noble families whose cooperation remained essential to royal authority. These sessions would have been conducted in the measured tones of Highland diplomacy, where directness and courtesy combined to create an atmosphere of mutual respect even amid disagreement. The young prince learned to recognize the difference between problems that required immediate decisive action and those that benefited from patient cultivation of consensus. He absorbed the understanding that royal power, like mountain rivers, achieves its greatest effect not through dramatic floods, but through persistent, purposeful flow. In quieter moments, perhaps standing on palace battlements as evening stars emerged above familiar peaks, Tigranes must have contemplated the weight of destiny that rested on his young shoulders. The kingdom he would inherit represented the accumulated hopes and sacrifices of generations. Its future expansion would depend on his ability to synthesize everything he had learned into wisdom that could guide an empire. The formation of character, like the formation of mountains, occurs through pressures applied over time until common materials transform into something capable of bearing extraordinary weight. In Tigranes' case, the pressures were the competing demands of tradition and innovation, local loyalty and international ambition, personal desire and public responsibility. The synthesis of these forces created not merely a competent ruler, but a visionary whose dreams would stretch from the Caspian Sea to the Mediterranean, reshaping the political geography of the ancient world. As sleep settled over the mountain palace and the future king prepared for rest, the very stones seemed to whisper of the greatness that lay ahead, of the day when this young man's decisions would affect the lives of millions, and his name would be remembered as long as men told stories of power and glory. The expansion of Tigranes' kingdom began not with the thunder of armies, but with the patient work of diplomacy and reconnaissance. Like dawn creeping across mountain valleys before the sun appears above the peaks, the king who had spent his youth learning to balance competing demands now applied that wisdom to the infinitely more complex challenge of extending Armenian authority across territories that encompass different peoples, different languages, different dreams of prosperity and security. The first campaigns unfolded with the methodical precision of a master craftsman shaping precious materials. Tigranes understood that lasting conquest required more than military victory. It demanded the creation of administrative systems that could transform defeated enemies into productive subjects, that could channel the energies of diverse populations toward common purposes while respecting the local traditions that gave meaning to their daily lives. Picture the Armenian army as it moved through the mountain passes that led toward the first objectives of expansion. Not the chaotic mass of warriors that populated romantic imagination, but a disciplined force that represented the synthesis of highland courage with international military science. Armenian cavalry, bred from horses that had learned endurance in the demanding terrain of their homeland, formed the mobile striking force that could exploit tactical opportunities with devastating effectiveness. Infantry units, organized according to principles learned from Greek military theorists but adapted to highland conditions, provided the steady strength that could hold gains once achieved. Yet the true genius of Tigranes' expansion lay not in military innovation, but in political sophistication. Each conquered territory faced a choice that revealed the essential character of Armenian imperialism: resist and face destruction, or submit and discover that Armenian rule could enhance rather than diminish local prosperity. Cities that opened their gates found themselves incorporated into a trading network that connected the Silk routes of Asia with the commercial centers of the Mediterranean. Local leaders who pledged loyalty discovered that Armenian administration offered opportunities for advancement that exceeded anything available under previous rulers. The logistics of expansion required organizational capabilities that transformed the Armenian kingdom itself. Supply lines stretching across hundreds of miles demanded coordination that involved not merely military quartermasters but civilian contractors, local guides, diplomatic negotiators who could arrange safe passage through territories not yet under Armenian control. Each campaign became a complex dance of military action, political negotiation, and economic calculation that tested every aspect of royal administration. In the captured cities, as Armenian banners replaced local symbols of authority, the new rulers faced the delicate task of establishing legitimacy among populations who had known different traditions of governance. Tigranes' genius revealed itself in policies that combined firmness with flexibility, that demanded obedience while offering genuine benefits in return. Local religious practices continued under Armenian protection. Local legal traditions were preserved where they did not conflict with imperial needs. Local leaders found their authority confirmed rather than eliminated when they demonstrated wisdom in serving the new imperial system. The psychological dimensions of expansion proved as challenging as the military and administrative aspects. Success created its own momentum, generating expectations among Armenian nobles for continued conquest and among subject peoples for continued benefits from imperial rule. Each victory raised the stakes for subsequent campaigns, Each territorial gain created new frontiers that required defense and new populations that required integration into the expanding imperial system. As evening descended on the expanding empire, when the day's marching ceased and armies made camp under stars that shone over territories now bearing Armenian rule, soldiers around countless fires shared stories that transformed individual experiences into collective legend. They spoke of cities that surrendered without fighting when they learned of Armenian approach, of local peoples who welcomed the order and prosperity that followed imperial administration, of wealth beyond highland dreams flowing toward Armenian treasuries as distant provinces contributed their share to imperial greatness. The king himself, reviewing reports from across his expanding domains, must have marveled at the transformation he had set in motion. The mountain kingdom of his inheritance was becoming something unprecedented in Armenian history, an empire whose authority would soon stretch from sea to sea, whose decisions would influence the balance of power among the great nations of the ancient world. Yet with each success came the recognition that expansion itself was becoming a force that demanded continued expansion, that the empire was developing its own momentum, which might eventually prove difficult to control. In the quiet moments before sleep, even the most successful conqueror must wonder whether he guides his destiny or is guided by it. Whether the empire serves the king or the king serves the empire's inexorable demands for growth. In the years when Tigranes' empire reached its zenith, roughly 80 to 70 BCE, the Armenian king could stand upon the heights of his mountain palace and know that his authority extended further than any Armenian ruler had ever dreamed possible. From the shores of the Caspian Sea to the Mediterranean coast, from the Caucasus Mountains to the Syrian deserts, the royal banners of Armenia cast their shadow over territories that encompassed much of what we now know as Turkey, Syria, Lebanon, and portions of Iraq and Iran. This was empire on a scale that rivaled Rome itself, a dominion so vast that royal messengers required months to carry decrees from the highland capital to the furthest provinces, yet so efficiently administered that local governors throughout this enormous territory coordinated their policies with the precision of musicians following a master composer's score. The achievement represented not merely military conquest but administrative genius, the ability to create unity among diversity, to foster prosperity across territories whose peoples spoke different languages and honored different gods. Imagine the cosmopolitan magnificence of the imperial capital during these peak years, when the seasonal arrival of tribute caravans transformed the highland city into a showcase of international wealth and culture. Silk merchants from China negotiated with wine traders from the Mediterranean, while Armenian nobles calculated the value of goods that represented the concentrated prosperity of half the known world. Persian carpets graced floors where Greek philosophers debated with Armenian scholars, while craftsmen from Syria and Mesopotamia shared techniques with highland artisans whose work would soon reflect this unprecedented synthesis of influences. The palace itself had become an architectural marvel that embodied the empire's cultural achievement. Armenian engineers, applying principles learned from Greek masters but adapted to highland conditions, had created structures that combined the grandeur appropriate to imperial power with the practical wisdom demanded by mountain weather. Halls that could accommodate hundreds of courtiers also provided efficient heating during the harsh highland winters. Reception chambers designed to impress foreign ambassadors also served as practical spaces for the daily business of governing territories that spanned multiple time zones. The administrative system that governed this vast empire represented perhaps Tigranes' greatest achievement, the creation of governmental structures that balanced central authority with local autonomy, that maintained imperial unity while respecting regional diversity. Provincial governors, many of them local leaders whose loyalty had been secured through generous treatment rather than mere force, administered territories according to principles that recognized both imperial needs and local conditions. Tribute systems operated according to formulas that seemed reasonable to subject peoples while generating the resources necessary to maintain imperial infrastructure and defense. The military forces that defended this enormous territory reflected the same synthesis of local tradition and international innovation that characterized every aspect of imperial administration. Armenian cavalry remained the core of imperial striking power, but infantry units now included soldiers trained in tactics learned from Greek military theorists and equipped with weapons manufactured according to techniques imported from across the known world. Fortress systems protected crucial mountain passes and strategic river crossings, while naval forces, an innovation that would have seemed impossible to earlier Armenian rulers, patrolled coastal waters and protected the sea routes that connected distant provinces. Yet perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the empire at its zenith was the degree to which prosperity and security had become mutually reinforcing throughout the imperial territory. Trade routes that connected previously isolated regions created wealth that funded further infrastructure development. Infrastructure improvements facilitated increased trade that generated resources for territorial expansion. Territorial expansion incorporated new populations whose productivity contributed to imperial strength that enabled the cycle to continue on an ever-expanding scale. In the great library that had become one of the empire's proudest achievements, scholars from across the known world gathered to pursue learning that transcended the boundaries of individual kingdoms or cultures. Armenian translations of Greek philosophical works sat beside Persian astronomical treatises and Mesopotamian mathematical calculations, creating a repository of human knowledge that served both practical imperial needs and the higher purposes of intellectual advancement. Students who came to study in the imperial capital returned to their home provinces carrying not merely advanced learning, but a cosmopolitan perspective that strengthened the cultural bonds holding the empire together. As evening descended on this vast domain, when the sun that had risen over the Caspian Sea finally set beyond the Mediterranean, the lights that flickered to life in countless cities and towns represented the individual lives that found meaning and security within the imperial system. Farmers whose granaries contributed to imperial food supplies, artisans whose products traveled imperial trade routes, merchants whose calculations involved currencies from dozens of different regions, all participated in an economic and cultural synthesis that had transformed the very meaning of civilization in their part of the world. The king himself, reviewing reports that detailed the prosperity and security enjoyed throughout his enormous domain, must have recognized that he had achieved something that exceeded even his most ambitious youth dreams. The empire that stretched from sea to sea represented not merely territorial conquest, but cultural creation, the establishment of conditions under which human potential could flourish on an unprecedented scale. Yet even in these moments of greatest triumph, the wisdom acquired through years of governing diverse populations whispered warnings about the challenges that accompany such magnificent achievement. Empires that grow large also grow complex. Territories that seem secure can become vulnerable. Success that exceeds all precedent can create expectations that exceed all possibility of fulfillment. In the quiet hours before dawn, even the most successful emperor must contemplate the eternal truth that what human ambition creates, human frailty can also destroy. Beyond the grand narratives of conquest and diplomacy, beyond the impressive statistics of territorial expansion and tribute collection, the true measure of Tigranes' empire lay in the daily experiences of ordinary people whose lives unfolded within the security and prosperity that imperial administration provided. In countless villages and towns across the vast imperial domain, the rhythms of human existence had been transformed by participation in something larger than local tradition, something that connected individual labors to imperial purposes while enhancing rather than diminishing the satisfactions of family, community, and personal achievement. Consider a typical morning in a provincial town somewhere in the Syrian territories that had become part of the Armenian Empire. As dawn breaks over landscapes that blend familiar Middle Eastern contours with the increasingly common sight of Armenian architectural influences, the marketplace begins to stir with activity that reflects the cosmopolitan character of imperial life. Local merchants arrange displays of goods that include not merely traditional regional products, but exotic items that have travelled the trade routes connecting the empire's furthest extremes. Here, perhaps, a potter whose techniques reflect the synthesis of local clay-working traditions with innovations learned from Armenian craftsmen who studied in the imperial capital. There, a spice merchant whose inventory includes highland herbs from the Armenian Heartland, alongside traditional Middle Eastern aromatics and exotic seasonings that have arrived via caravan routes extending to the edges of the known world. The conversations that accompany commercial transactions reflect this cultural diversity. Local dialects enhanced by Armenian administrative terminology, Greek philosophical concepts, Persian commercial practices that have become part of the common vocabulary of imperial prosperity. The farmer whose grain helps feed not merely his local community, but distant garrisons that maintain imperial security experiences. His daily labour as participation in something that gives individual effort broader meaning and greater reward. Imperial agricultural policies that encourage improved farming techniques and guarantee markets for surplus production have transformed subsistence survival into genuine prosperity. The roads that carry his produce to regional distribution centres also bring back manufactured goods, imported luxuries, and cultural influences that enrich highland village life in ways that would have seemed impossible under previous political arrangements. In the workshops where artisans practice crafts that blend local traditions with techniques imported from across the empire, individual creativity finds expression through participation in production networks that connect the humblest village craftsmen to the sophisticated tastes of imperial courtiers. The carpenter whose furniture reflects Armenian highland joinery methods adapted to local woods and local preferences, the weaver whose textiles combine traditional regional patterns with dyes and fibers that have arrived via imperial trade routes, the metalsmith whose tools and weapons represent the synthesis of highland metallurgy with innovations developed in distant provinces, all participate in a cultural flowering that exceeds anything possible within purely local traditions. The evening hours, when families gather around tables laden with food that reflects both local agricultural abundance and imperial commercial connections, witness conversations that reveal the psychological transformation accompanying political integration. Children learn stories that connect their local heritage to the broader imperial narrative. Adults discuss opportunities and challenges that transcend village boundaries. Elders reflect on changes that have enhanced security and prosperity while preserving the essential character of community life. The religious observances that mark significant moments in community life demonstrate the cultural synthesis that characterized imperial policy at its most successful. Local deities receive honors that incorporate ceremonial elements learned from neighboring provinces. Traditional festivals acquire additional significance through participation in empire-wide celebrations. Sacred buildings constructed according to local architectural traditions employ techniques and materials that have become available through imperial trade and cultural exchange. Yet perhaps the most remarkable aspect of daily life in Tigranes' empire was the degree to which individual ambition could find expression through imperial opportunities while remaining rooted in local community values. The young man whose education in local schools had been enhanced by imperial educational innovations could aspire to administrative positions that would take him to distant provinces while maintaining connections to family and community that gave his achievements personal meaning. The young woman, whose artistic talents reflected both local traditions and cosmopolitan influences, could find patrons and markets that extended far beyond anything available in purely regional settings. In the quiet moments before sleep, When the day's activities yielded to the peaceful contemplation that accompanies security and satisfaction, the inhabitants of Tigranes' empire could reflect on lives that had been enriched rather than diminished by participation in something larger than individual existence. The empire provided not merely political stability and economic opportunity, but cultural horizons that expanded individual possibilities while respecting the local loyalties that gave those possibilities meaning. This synthesis of individual fulfillment and collective achievement represented perhaps Tigranes' greatest accomplishment: the creation of political and cultural conditions under which human potential could flourish across enormous territories and among enormously diverse populations. The daily life that unfolded throughout the imperial domain testified to the possibility that empire could serve not merely imperial ambition, but human flourishing. Not merely the concentration of power, but the distribution of opportunity and security among all who contributed to imperial prosperity. Beyond the grand narratives of conquest and diplomacy, beyond the impressive statistics of territorial expansion and tribute collection, the true measure of Tigranes' empire lay in the daily experiences of ordinary people whose lives unfolded within the security and prosperity that imperial administration provided. In countless villages and towns across the vast imperial domain, the rhythms of human existence had been transformed by participation in something larger than local tradition, something that connected individual labors to imperial purposes while enhancing rather than diminishing the satisfactions of family, community, and personal achievement. Consider a typical morning in a provincial town somewhere in the Syrian territories that had become part of the Armenian Empire. As dawn breaks over landscapes that blend familiar Middle Eastern contours with the increasingly common sight of Armenian architectural influences, the marketplace begins to stir with activity that reflects the cosmopolitan character of imperial life. Local merchants arrange displays of goods that include not merely traditional regional products, but exotic items that have traveled the trade routes connecting the empire's furthest extremes. Here, perhaps, a potter whose techniques reflect the synthesis of local clay-working traditions with innovations learned from Armenian craftsmen who studied in the imperial capital. There, a spice merchant whose inventory includes highland herbs from the Armenian Heartland, alongside traditional Middle Eastern aromatics and exotic seasonings that have arrived via caravan routes extending to the edges of the known world. The conversations that accompany commercial transactions reflect this cultural diversity. Local dialects enhanced by Armenian administrative terminology, Greek philosophical concepts, Persian commercial practices that have become part of the common vocabulary of imperial prosperity. The farmer whose grain helps feed not merely his local community, but distant garrisons that maintain imperial security experiences. His daily labor as participation in something that gives individual effort broader meaning and greater reward. Imperial agricultural policies that encourage improved farming techniques and guarantee markets for surplus production have transformed subsistence survival into genuine prosperity. The roads that carry his produce to regional distribution centers also bring back manufactured goods, imported luxuries, and cultural influences that enrich highland village life in ways that would have seemed impossible under previous political arrangements. In the workshops where artisans practice crafts that blend local traditions with techniques imported from across the empire, individual creativity finds expression through participation in production networks that connect the humblest village craftsmen to the sophisticated tastes of imperial courtiers. The carpenter whose furniture reflects Armenian highland joinery methods adapted to local woods and local preferences, the weaver whose textiles combine traditional regional patterns with dyes and fibers that have arrived via imperial trade routes, the metalsmith whose tools and weapons represent the synthesis of highland metallurgy with innovations developed in distant provinces, all participate in a cultural flowering that exceeds anything possible within purely local traditions. The evening hours, when families gather around tables laden with food that reflects both local agricultural abundance and imperial commercial connections, witness conversations that reveal the psychological transformation accompanying political integration. Children learn stories that connect their local heritage to the broader imperial narrative. Adults discuss opportunities and challenges that transcend village boundaries. Elders reflect on changes that have enhanced security and prosperity while preserving the essential character of community life. The religious observances that mark significant moments in community life demonstrate the cultural synthesis that characterized imperial policy at its most successful. Local deities receive honors that incorporate ceremonial elements learned from neighboring provinces. Traditional festivals acquire additional significance through participation in empire-wide celebrations. Sacred buildings constructed according to local architectural traditions employ techniques and materials that have become available through imperial trade and cultural exchange. Yet perhaps the most remarkable aspect of daily life in Tigranes' empire was the degree to which individual ambition could find expression through imperial opportunities while remaining rooted in local community values. The young man, whose education in local schools had been enhanced by imperial educational innovations, could aspire to administrative positions that would take him to distant provinces while maintaining connections to family and community that gave his achievements personal meaning. The young woman, whose artistic talents reflected both local traditions and cosmopolitan influences, could find patrons and markets that extended far beyond anything available in purely regional settings. In the quiet moments before sleep, when the day's activities yielded to the peaceful contemplation that accompanies security and satisfaction, the inhabitants of Tigranes' empire could reflect on lives that had been enriched rather than diminished by participation in something larger than individual existence. The empire provided not merely political stability and economic opportunity, but cultural horizons that expanded individual possibilities while respecting the local loyalties that gave those possibilities meaning. This synthesis of individual fulfillment and collective achievement represented perhaps Tigranes' greatest accomplishment: the creation of political and cultural conditions under which human potential could flourish across enormous territories and among enormously diverse populations. The daily life that unfolded throughout the imperial domain testified to the possibility that empire could serve not merely imperial ambition, but human flourishing. Not merely the concentration of power, but the distribution of opportunity and security among all who contributed to imperial prosperity. The prosperity and security that characterized Tigranes' empire at its zenith created conditions that fostered an unprecedented flowering of cultural achievement, a golden age when political success provided the foundation for artistic innovation, intellectual advancement, and architectural magnificence that synthesized influences from across the known world while maintaining distinctly Armenian character and vision. In the scriptoriums and libraries that had become centers of imperial intellectual life, scholars engaged in translation projects that preserved and transmitted the accumulated wisdom of ancient civilizations while creating new syntheses that reflected the cosmopolitan character of Armenian imperial culture. Greek philosophical treatises found new life through Armenian translation and commentary that related classical wisdom to highland experiences and imperial responsibilities. Persian astronomical observations, enhanced by mathematical techniques learned from Mesopotamian masters, enabled calendar reforms that improved agricultural planning throughout the imperial domain. Historical chronicles that recorded the achievements of various peoples became source material for imperial histories that celebrated the diversity of cultures contributing to Armenian greatness. The royal patronage system that supported this intellectual flowering operated according to principles that balanced imperial purposes with genuine respect for learning and creativity. Scholars who demonstrated exceptional ability found themselves invited to the imperial capital, where they joined intellectual communities that transcended the boundaries of individual kingdoms or cultures. Libraries equipped with texts gathered from across the empire provided research facilities that exceeded anything available in purely regional centers. Support for translation projects, copying initiatives, and original research created an intellectual infrastructure that served both immediate imperial needs and the long-term preservation of human knowledge. Imagine the architectural projects that transformed the imperial capital and provincial centers into showcases of imperial cultural achievement. The royal palace complex, expanded and enhanced to reflect the empire's unprecedented scope and sophistication, combined Armenian highland building traditions with architectural innovations learned from Greek masters and Persian imperial precedents. Courtyards designed according to geometric principles that reflected both mathematical sophistication and aesthetic sensibility provided settings for ceremonies that honored both local traditions and imperial grandeur. The temple construction projects that adorned imperial cities represented perhaps the most visible expression of the cultural synthesis that characterized Tigranes' reign. Local deities received honor in structures that employed architectural vocabularies learned from across the empire while maintaining the essential character that made religious observance meaningful to local populations. Sacred buildings that incorporated Syrian stonework techniques, Persian decorative traditions, Greek proportional principles, and Armenian highland engineering solutions created worship spaces that embodied the imperial vision of unity within diversity. The workshops that supplied the empire's demand for luxury goods and ceremonial objects became centers of artistic innovation that attracted craftsmen from throughout the known world. Armenian metalworkers, applying techniques learned from Syrian masters to highland materials and design traditions, created jewelry and ceremonial weapons that combined technical excellence with aesthetic achievement. Textile production that employed silk imported from Asia, dyes developed in Mediterranean coastal cities, and weaving techniques perfected in Mesopotamian workshops created fabrics that adorned both imperial ceremonies and the daily life of prosperous provincial families. The cultural achievements of this golden age reflected not merely imperial wealth, but imperial vision, the understanding that political success creates both the opportunity and the responsibility to foster human achievement that transcends immediate practical needs. The artistic patronage that supported painters, sculptors, musicians, and poets served imperial prestige while genuinely advancing human creative potential. The educational initiatives that established schools throughout the empire served administrative efficiency while creating opportunities for individual intellectual development that enriched entire communities. In the evening hours, when imperial courtiers gathered for entertainments that reflected the cosmopolitan character of Armenian cultural life, the performances they enjoyed demonstrated the creative synthesis that had become the hallmark of imperial achievement. Musicians whose compositions employed scales and instruments from multiple traditions, poets whose verses drew upon literary conventions learned from various cultures while expressing distinctly Armenian themes, dancers whose movements reflected the integration of highland folk traditions with courtly sophistication learned from international influences. Yet perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this cultural golden age was its accessibility to populations throughout the empire, rather than merely the imperial elite. Provincial schools that taught local children to read and write in their native languages, while introducing them to imperial administrative practices and cosmopolitan cultural influences. Local festivals that incorporated elements learned from neighboring provinces while maintaining their essential local character. The architectural legacy of Tigranes' cultural patronage continued to inspire admiration long after the empire itself had passed into historical memory. Visitors to sites that once flourished under Armenian rule could trace the outline of buildings that had embodied imperial ambition tempered by cultural sensitivity. Engineering innovation guided by aesthetic wisdom, construction projects that served practical needs, while creating beauty that enriched daily life for ordinary people as well as imperial courtiers. As night settled over the empire at the height of its cultural achievement, the lights that illuminated workshops where artists pursued their crafts, libraries where scholars explored the accumulated wisdom of ages, and homes where families enjoyed the benefits of imperial prosperity and cultural flowering, testified to the possibility that political power could serve not merely imperial ambition, but human flourishing in its fullest expression. The cultural golden age that characterized Tigranes' empire represented the synthesis of security and opportunity, diversity and unity, tradition and innovation that transforms mere territorial control into genuine civilization. As the Armenian Empire reached its zenith of territorial extent and cultural achievement, a shadow began to lengthen across the eastern horizon, the shadow of Roman power, systematic and inexorable, representing a form of imperialism that differed fundamentally from the Armenian model of expansion through synthesis and accommodation. The growing tension between these two imperial systems would ultimately determine not merely the fate of Tigranes' achievement, but the future character of civilization in the eastern Mediterranean world. The early diplomatic contacts between Armenian and Roman representatives revealed the profound differences in imperial philosophy that would make conflict increasingly inevitable. Roman ambassadors, arriving in the Armenian capital with the confidence of men who represented a power that had systematically absorbed or destroyed every rival it had encountered, expected the kind of deference that characterized Rome's relationships with client kingdoms throughout the Mediterranean world. They discovered instead an imperial court that regarded itself as the equal of Rome, backed by territorial extent and cultural achievement that rivaled anything in Roman experience. Picture those initial diplomatic encounters in the Great Hall of Tigranes' palace, where cultural sophistication met cultural arrogance in conversations that revealed the impossibility of accommodation between two systems of imperial organization. Roman representatives, accustomed to negotiations that ended with acknowledgement of Roman supremacy, found themselves dealing with Armenian courtiers who spoke Latin and Greek with perfect fluency, while making it clear that such linguistic accomplishments represented cultural sophistication rather than political submission. Armenian ambassadors traveling to Rome with gifts appropriate to exchanges between equal powers encountered a political system that recognized no equals and viewed such gestures as evidence of weakness rather than courtesy. The psychological dimensions of this emerging rivalry reflected the collision between two different concepts of imperial legitimacy. Roman power rested upon military superiority so systematic and overwhelming that resistance seemed futile. Submission to Roman authority appeared not merely prudent, but inevitable. Armenian power rested. Armenian power rested upon the more complex foundation of cultural synthesis and administrative accommodation that had enabled diverse populations to flourish under imperial unity while maintaining their distinctive identities. The Roman model demanded assimilation. The Armenian approach fostered integration. These philosophical differences translated into practical incompatibilities that diplomacy alone could not resolve. In the quiet chambers where royal advisors gathered to assess the growing Roman threat, the conversations that shaped imperial policy revealed the profound challenge facing Armenian leadership. Intelligence reports from Western territories described Roman military capabilities that exceeded anything in Armenian experience, not merely larger armies, but systematically superior organization, standardized equipment, engineering capabilities that could bridge rivers and breach fortifications that had previously seemed impregnable. Yet these same reports suggested that Roman success came at the cost of cultural destruction, that territories absorbed into the Roman system lost the diversity and local autonomy that had characterized the Armenian imperial model. The strategic calculations that occupied Tigranes and his advisors during these crucial years reflected the terrible clarity that accompanies recognition of existential threat. The empire that had grown through patient expansion and diplomatic accommodation now faced a rival that grew through systematic conquest and cultural transformation. The administrative systems that had successfully integrated diverse populations into Armenian imperial unity would be tested against military and political pressures designed to shatter such integration and replace it with Roman uniformity. The economic dimensions of the growing conflict revealed another fundamental difference between the two imperial systems. Armenian prosperity rested upon trade networks that connected diverse regions in mutually beneficial exchange, creating wealth through the coordination of complementary strengths rather than the exploitation of inferior weaknesses. Roman wealth increasingly depended upon the systematic extraction of resources from conquered territories, a model that generated enormous immediate returns while potentially exhausting the sources of long-term prosperity. As tensions escalated into active preparation for conflict, the psychological atmosphere throughout the Armenian Empire reflected the complex emotions that accompany the recognition that an entire way of life faces challenge from forces beyond local control. In provincial towns that had flourished under Armenian rule, inhabitants who had enjoyed unprecedented prosperity and cultural opportunity now faced the possibility that these achievements might be swept away by military forces that recognized no value in the diversity and accommodation that had made such achievements possible. The military preparations that consumed increasing imperial attention and resources revealed both the strengths and limitations of the Armenian system when confronted with systematic external threat. Armenian forces, accustomed to campaigns that combined military action with diplomatic negotiation, struggled to adapt to Roman warfare that aimed not at political accommodation but at total victory. Highland warriors whose courage had never been questioned found themselves facing tactical challenges that required technical innovations and systematic training programs that strained traditional military organization. Yet perhaps the most profound challenge posed by growing Roman pressure was psychological rather than military. The Armenian Empire had succeeded by convincing diverse populations that imperial unity enhanced rather than threatened local identity, that participation in something larger than tribal or regional tradition created opportunities rather than obligations. Roman expansion, by contrast, appeared to demand the surrender of such local identity in favor of systematic uniformity that might provide security and prosperity, but at the cost of cultural authenticity. In the evening hours, when royal courts throughout the empire gathered for entertainments that had become expressions of cultural achievement and imperial pride, the conversations increasingly turned to questions that had no comfortable answers. Could the Armenian model of imperial organization survive contact with a Roman system that appeared to offer only the alternatives of submission or destruction? Did the cultural and administrative achievements that represented the empire's greatest accomplishments provide sufficient foundation for military resistance against systematically superior force? The diplomatic initiatives that continued even as military preparations intensified reflected Tigranes' understanding that political accommodation remained preferable to military confrontation, regardless of the provocations offered by Roman intransigence. Armenian ambassadors carried proposals for territorial division that would preserve Armenian independence while acknowledging Roman spheres of influence. Roman responses revealed the futility of such hopes. Roman imperial logic recognized no independent equals, only subjects who had not yet acknowledged their proper status. As the shadow of Roman power lengthened across territories that had known peace and prosperity under Armenian rule, the inhabitants of Tigranes' empire faced the recognition that their achievements, however magnificent, existed within a larger world where strength ultimately determined survival. The cultural flowering, administrative innovation, and economic prosperity that had characterized the Armenian Golden Age now required protection by military capabilities that had never been tested against systematic opposition. The tragedy that was approaching lay not in Armenian weakness, but in the incompatibility between two successful models of imperial organization, one that succeeded through accommodation and synthesis, another that succeeded through systematic conquest and assimilation. The conflict that would soon engulf the Eastern Mediterranean represented not merely a struggle between armies, but a confrontation between fundamentally different visions of how human societies might organize themselves for security, prosperity, and cultural achievement. In the gathering storm of Roman expansion, Tigranes found an ally whose own kingdom faced the same existential threat, whose resources and strategic position offered the possibility of coordinated resistance that neither empire could achieve alone. Mithridates VI of Pontus, known to history as Mithridates the Great, ruled territories along the Black Sea coast with the same combination of cultural sophistication and military capability that characterized Armenian imperial administration. The alliance between these two monarchs represented both strategic necessity and fatal miscalculation, a partnership born of shared danger that would ultimately accelerate the catastrophe both kings sought to avoid. The negotiations that led to formal alliance unfolded in mountain strongholds, where royal representatives could meet beyond the reach of Roman intelligence networks, where the details of coordinated resistance could be planned with the care that such desperate enterprises demanded. Picture these clandestine gatherings, where Armenian and Pontic diplomats calculated the resources available for joint operations, while recognizing that failure would mean not merely military defeat, but the complete destruction of the independent kingdoms that had given their lives meaning and purpose. The strategic logic that made alliance seem not merely desirable but inevitable reflected accurate assessment of Roman capabilities and intentions. Intelligence reports from territories that had recently experienced Roman conquest painted terrifying pictures of systematic destruction that followed military victory. Populations enslaved or relocated, local leaders executed or exiled, cultural institutions disbanded or transformed beyond recognition. Neither Armenia nor Pontus could expect treatment different from that accorded to other kingdoms that had attempted to resist Roman expansion. Yet the alliance that seemed to offer hope of successful resistance also created vulnerabilities that Roman commanders would exploit with devastating effectiveness. Coordination between armies separated by hundreds of miles demanded communication systems that Roman intelligence could monitor and disrupt. Joint operations required synchronized timing that became increasingly difficult to maintain as Roman pressure mounted simultaneously against both kingdoms. Most critically, alliance transformed two separate conflicts into a single war that Rome could approach with the full concentration of military resources that had overwhelmed individual opponents throughout the Mediterranean world. The early phases of coordinated resistance provided momentary encouragement that may have been more dangerous than immediate defeat. Armenian and Pontic forces, operating according to plans developed through careful consultation and mutual accommodation, achieved tactical successes that seemed to validate the alliance strategy. Local Roman commanders, caught between simultaneous pressures from two directions, struggled to coordinate responses that could address both threats effectively. Reports reaching the imperial capitals suggested that Roman military superiority might not prove decisive when confronted with systematic, coordinated opposition. These initial successes, however, contained the seeds of ultimate disaster. Roman military doctrine, developed through centuries of systematic conquest, included procedures for responding to coordinated threats that individual Roman commanders might find challenging. The Roman Senate, recognizing the unprecedented danger posed by Armenian Pontic alliance, authorized military resources and appointed commanders whose capabilities exceeded anything that either Eastern Kingdom had previously confronted. The logistical challenges of maintaining coordinated operations across enormous distances gradually undermined the effectiveness that had made alliance seem promising. Armenian armies, operating far from their highland bases in terrain that favored different tactical approaches, struggled to maintain the supply lines that sustained extended campaigns. Pontic forces, attempting to coordinate their operations with Armenian strategic objectives, found their flexibility constrained by the need to support allies whose military traditions emphasized different approaches to warfare. Perhaps most critically, the alliance gradually transformed both kingdoms from independent actors pursuing their own strategic objectives into junior partners in a coordinated resistance that neither could fully control. Armenian resources, diverted from traditional territorial defense to support joint operations, left highland fortresses vulnerable to Roman initiatives that exploited the temporary absence of local defenders. Pontic territories, similarly exposed by the demands of coordinated campaigning, faced Roman pressures that individual kingdom resources might have been sufficient to address, but that became overwhelming when combined with the obligations of alliance. The personal relationship between Tigranes and Mithridates, initially characterized by mutual respect and shared strategic vision, gradually deteriorated under the pressures that accompany unsuccessful cooperation in desperate circumstances. Each king faced criticism from advisors who questioned the wisdom of alliance commitments that seemed to compromise rather than enhance imperial security. Communication difficulties that accompanied coordinated operations created misunderstandings that generated suspicion about ally commitment and competence. In the quiet hours when royal councils assessed the progress of joint resistance efforts, the conversations that shaped continuing policy revealed the tragic irony of alliance that had been undertaken to preserve independence, but that increasingly constrained the freedom of action that made independence meaningful. Armenian strategic flexibility, traditionally one of the kingdom's greatest assets, became limited by obligations to coordinate operations with Pontic forces whose capabilities and limitations differed significantly from highland military traditions. The intelligence reports that reached both royal capitals during the later phases of the Mithridatic Wars painted increasingly disturbing pictures of Roman adaptations that systematically addressed the challenges posed by coordinated Eastern resistance. Roman commanders, initially surprised by the effectiveness of Armenian Pontic cooperation, developed countermeasures that exploited the communication difficulties and logistical vulnerabilities that inevitably accompanied joint operations across enormous distances. As the alliance that had promised mutual salvation gradually revealed itself as a source of mutual vulnerability, both Tigranes and Mithridates faced the terrible recognition that their attempt to preserve independence through cooperation had instead accelerated the confrontation with Roman power that might have been delayed, if not avoided, through different strategic choices. The coordinate resistance that had seemed to represent their best hope for survival had instead provided Roman commanders with the justification and opportunity for systematic campaigns that would determine the fate of both kingdoms. The arrival of Lucius Licinius Lucullus in Armenian territory marked the beginning of the end for Tigranes' empire, though the full magnitude of this catastrophe would reveal itself only gradually. Like a mountain avalanche that begins with the fall of a single stone, Lucullus came not as a mere military commander, but as the representative of a military system that had perfected the art of systematic conquest, bringing with him legions whose discipline and engineering capabilities would prove revolutionarily superior to anything in Armenian experience. The initial encounters between Armenian forces and Roman legionaries revealed a gap in military effectiveness that exceeded the worst fears of Tigranes' advisors. Highland warriors, whose courage had never been questioned and whose tactical flexibility had secured victory in countless previous campaigns, found themselves confronting an enemy that fought according to principles that rendered traditional Armenian advantages irrelevant. Roman legions advanced in formations that maintained cohesion under conditions that scattered traditional armies. Roman engineering units bridged rivers and reduced fortifications that had historically provided secure defensive positions. Roman supply systems maintained operational capability across distances that had previously limited campaign duration to seasonal cycles. Picture the psychological shock that accompanied Armenian forces' first full engagement with Roman military professionalism. Veterans of successful campaigns throughout the Eastern Mediterranean world discovered that their accumulated experience provided little guidance for fighting an enemy whose tactical doctrines, equipment standards, and logistical capabilities represented systematic advantages rather than mere numerical superiority. The individual courage that had sustained Armenian military success throughout Tigranes' expansion proved insufficient when confronted with Roman coordination that transformed individual legionary competence into collective effectiveness that exceeded the sum of its parts. The siege warfare that characterized Lucullus's systematic reduction of Armenian strongholds demonstrated Roman engineering capabilities that revolutionized the very meaning of defensive security. Mountain fortresses that had been considered impregnable, positioned on heights that commanded surrounding valleys and supplied by springs that could sustain garrisons through extended sieges, fell to Roman techniques that combined patient investment with innovative approaches to traditional defensive advantages. Roman siege engines, constructed according to mathematical principles that reflected centuries of engineering development, achieved ranges and accuracy that nullified the protection offered by traditional fortification design. Yet perhaps more devastating than Roman military superiority was the systematic character of Roman conquest that left no room for the diplomatic accommodation that had traditionally enabled defeated populations to preserve essential aspects of their cultural identity while acknowledging political subordination. Roman occupation forces arrived in conquered territories with administrative procedures that replaced local governmental structures rather than incorporating them, with taxation systems that extracted wealth according to Roman rather than local economic traditions, with legal frameworks that substituted Roman law for traditional dispute resolution mechanisms that had maintained community cohesion for generations. The population movements that accompanied Roman conquest revealed another dimension of the catastrophe facing Armenian civilization. Families that had lived in the same highland valleys for generations found themselves forced to abandon ancestral homes as Roman military operations transformed familiar landscapes into battlefields. Artisans whose skills had contributed to imperial cultural flowering discovered that Roman administrative priorities had no place for the artistic traditions that had given meaning to their professional lives. Merchants whose commercial networks had connected distant provinces found their trade routes disrupted by military operations that recognized no distinction between combatants and civilians. Tigranes himself, forced to abandon the capital that had embodied his imperial achievements, experienced the personal anguish that accompanies the recognition that a lifetime's work faces systematic destruction by forces beyond any possibility of accommodation or resistance. The palace that had been enlarged and enhanced to reflect imperial grandeur now served as headquarters for Roman commanders whose reports to distant superiors described Armenian cultural achievements as obstacles to efficient administration rather than accomplishments worthy of preservation. The strategic retreat that characterized Armenian response to Lucullus's invasion reflected not cowardice, but the terrible wisdom that recognizes when continued resistance serves no purpose beyond the multiplication of suffering. Highland fortresses that might have sustained garrisons through extended sieges were abandoned to preserve the lives of defenders whose sacrifice would achieve nothing beyond symbolic gesture. Provincial administrators, who might have organized local resistance instead, focused their efforts on evacuating populations and preserving cultural treasures that represented the accumulated achievements of generations. In the refugee camps that sheltered populations displaced by Roman military operations, the conversations that sustained morale during these darkest hours revealed the depth of loss that accompanied military defeat. Families that had enjoyed unprecedented prosperity under imperial administration faced uncertain futures in territories where Armenian political authority no longer provided security or opportunity. Cultural traditions that had flourished under imperial patronage now required preservation through individual commitment rather than institutional support. The intelligence reports that reached Tigranes during his strategic withdrawal painted increasingly disturbing pictures of Roman military capabilities that suggested resistance could achieve nothing beyond the prolongation of suffering. Roman forces demonstrated organizational flexibility that adapted tactical approaches to highland terrain conditions, while maintaining the systematic coordination that had overwhelmed traditional defensive strategies. Roman supply systems sustained operational effectiveness across distances that had historically limited campaign duration and territorial scope. Yet, even in defeat, the character that had enabled Tigranes to create an empire that astonished the ancient world revealed itself in his refusal to surrender the essential dignity that accompanies genuine leadership. Rather than seeking personal survival through premature accommodation with Roman authority, he continued efforts to preserve what remained of Armenian independence, while recognizing that such efforts might require ultimate sacrifice of personal welfare for the sake of values that transcended individual existence. The first Roman invasion had demonstrated the futility of military resistance against systematically superior force, but it had also revealed the character of both conqueror and conquered in ways that would influence the final resolution of this tragedy. Lucullus had proven Roman military superiority beyond question, but he had also demonstrated that Roman conquest methods left little room for the cultural accommodation that might have transformed military victory into lasting political settlement. The arrival of Pompey the Great to assume command of Roman forces in the east marked the beginning of the final act in the tragedy of Tigranes' empire. Though this conclusion would unfold not through the thunderous drama of decisive battle, but through the quiet dignity of negotiated settlement that preserved essential human values while acknowledging the reality of changed circumstances. Pompey brought with him not merely military capabilities that exceeded even Lucullus's formidable resources, but political wisdom that recognized the difference between conquest and governance, between destroying opposition and creating stable foundations for lasting Roman authority. The diplomatic overtures that preceded final military confrontation revealed both the hopelessness of continued Armenian resistance and the possibility that surrender might preserve more than stubborn defiance could achieve. Pompey's emissaries, arriving in the mountain strongholds where Tigranes had established his final defensive positions, carried terms that offered genuine alternative to the systematic destruction that continued warfare would inevitably bring. The Roman commander had studied the Armenian situation with the careful attention of a statesman who understood that lasting settlement required accommodation of defeated dignity rather than mere humiliation of former enemies. Picture the internal struggle that consumed Tigranes as he contemplated the choice between hopeless resistance and negotiated submission. The king who had once ruled territories that stretched from sea to sea now controlled little more than the highland fortresses of his ancestral homeland, supported by loyal retainers whose continued sacrifice could achieve nothing beyond the multiplication of suffering. Yet the decision to negotiate represented not merely acknowledgement of military defeat, but acceptance that the imperial vision that had defined his life's work had proven incompatible with the larger forces that shaped the destiny of the ancient world. The negotiation process itself unfolded with the careful attention to dignity and protocol that enabled both sides to find honourable resolution to circumstances that might otherwise have demanded continued bloodshed. Roman representatives, operating according to instructions that reflected Pompey's understanding of the political necessities that would govern long-term administration of conquered territories, demonstrated respect for Armenian cultural traditions and royal dignity while making clear the fundamental changes that submission would require. The territorial adjustments that formed the core of the final settlement reflected both Roman strategic requirements and recognition that Armenian cooperation would prove more valuable than Armenian destruction. The vast empire that had once extended across much of the eastern Mediterranean world contracted to the traditional Armenian Heartland, territories that Rome acknowledged as more difficult to administer directly than to govern through reliable client relationships. Tribute obligations, while substantial, were calculated to demonstrate Armenian subordination without destroying the economic foundations that would enable such tribute to be paid consistently over time. The personal dimension of Tigranes' submission revealed the character that had enabled him to create an empire, and the wisdom that enabled him to preserve what remained when empire proved unsustainable. The ceremony that formalized Armenian acknowledgement of Roman supremacy proceeded according to protocols that honored both Roman victory and Armenian dignity, recognizing that lasting political settlements require accommodation of human pride as well as strategic necessity. The symbolic gestures that accompanied this political transformation carried emotional weight that transcended immediate practical concerns. The crown that had once symbolized authority over territories rivaling Rome itself now represented authority delegated by Roman power, exercised within boundaries established by Roman strategic requirements. Yet the continuity of royal dignity suggested that essential aspects of Armenian identity could survive political subordination, that cultural traditions might prove more durable than imperial boundaries. In the aftermath of formal settlement, as Armenian territories began adaptation to their new status as Roman client kingdom, the population that had experienced both imperial grandeur and military catastrophe faced the psychological challenge of finding meaning within dramatically reduced circumstances. Families that had enjoyed prosperity connected to imperial administration now discovered opportunities limited to regional rather than international scope. Cultural institutions that had flourished under imperial patronage now required support from resources constrained by tribute obligations and territorial limitations. Yet, the gradual emergence of stable relationships between Armenian local authority and Roman imperial administration suggested that accommodation might offer benefits that continued resistance could never have achieved. Roman recognition of Armenian client status provided security against external threats that independent Armenian resources might have proven insufficient to address. Roman trade networks offered economic opportunities that compensated partially for the loss of territories that had once contributed to Armenian prosperity. The wisdom that guided Tigranes through this final transformation of his kingdom reflected understanding that had developed through decades of experience with the complexities of governing diverse populations under changing circumstances. The king who had once dreamed of challenging Rome now devoted his remaining years to preserving whatever could be preserved of Armenian achievement while adapting to realities that no amount of courage or determination could change. In the quiet hours of evening, when the former emperor walked through palace halls that had once hummed with the business of governing territories spanning continents, the man who had achieved greatness beyond Armenian precedent contemplated the deeper meanings of success and failure, expansion and contraction, ambition and acceptance. The empire that had astonished the ancient world lived on not in territorial boundaries, but in the cultural synthesis and administrative innovations that had enabled diverse populations to flourish under unified authority. The final settlement that ended Tigranes' imperial ambitions represented not merely military defeat, but political maturation. The recognition that lasting achievement sometimes requires acceptance of limitations that wisdom includes understanding when accommodation serves human welfare better than continued resistance. The king, who had learned to think in terms of continental empire, had also learned to find meaning in the preservation of essential values within reduced circumstances, demonstrating that true leadership reveals itself as much in graceful acceptance of necessity as in ambitious pursuit of possibility. In the years that followed the Roman settlement, as Armenian society adapted to its transformed circumstances, the true measure of Tigranes' achievement revealed itself not in the territorial boundaries that had defined his empire, but in the cultural vitality and administrative sophistication that enabled Armenian civilization to flourish even within the constraints of client kingdom status. The end of imperial expansion marked not the conclusion of Armenian greatness, but its transformation into forms that would prove more durable than military conquest, more resilient than political independence. The immediate aftermath of imperial collapse presented challenges that tested every aspect of Armenian social organization and cultural identity. Noble families that had administered distant provinces now focused their energies on highland territories where their authority remained meaningful. Artisans whose skills had served imperial courts throughout the eastern Mediterranean adapted their techniques to local markets while preserving the cultural synthesis that had characterized the imperial Golden Age. Merchants, whose commercial networks had connected continents, redirected their activities toward regional trade that operated within Roman imperial systems while maintaining distinctly Armenian commercial practices. Picture the gradual emergence of new patterns of daily life that incorporated both the losses and the gains that accompanied political transformation. Highland communities that had contributed sons to imperial armies now invested that same human energy in agricultural innovations that increased local productivity. Educational institutions that had served imperial administrative needs evolved into schools that preserved Armenian cultural traditions while preparing young people for opportunities available within Roman client relationships. Religious practices that had incorporated influences from across the empire now focused on maintaining spiritual traditions that provided continuity and meaning during uncertain times. The psychological adaptation required by this transformation revealed both individual and collective strengths that had been obscured by imperial grandeur. Families that had defined their identity through participation in continental empire discovered sources of meaning in local community relationships and regional cultural achievements. Professional associations that had coordinated activities across vast territories found new purposes in preserving craft traditions and maintaining quality standards that kept Armenian products competitive in regional markets that remained accessible despite political subordination. The architectural projects that continued throughout the post-imperial period demonstrated the persistence of cultural ambition despite reduced political circumstances. Buildings that reflected the synthesis of influences that had characterized imperial architecture continued to grace highland cities, though financed by regional rather than continental resources. Construction techniques that had been developed for imperial purposes found new applications in infrastructure projects that served local needs while maintaining the aesthetic standards that had distinguished Armenian cultural achievement. The scholarly activities that preserved and transmitted the intellectual achievements of the imperial period represented perhaps the most crucial aspect of cultural continuity during political transition. Libraries that had collected texts from across the known world became repositories of learning that served regional educational needs while maintaining connections to international intellectual traditions. Translation projects that had created Armenian versions of Greek and Persian texts continued to make foreign learning accessible to local students while fostering the development of Armenian intellectual traditions that would influence learning throughout the region. Yet the most remarkable aspect of post-imperial adaptation was the degree to which former subjects of Armenian rule maintained cultural connections that transcended the political boundaries established by Roman settlement. Commercial relationships, family connections, and religious affiliations that had developed during the imperial period continued to link Armenian communities with populations throughout the eastern Mediterranean, creating informal networks that preserved cultural unity despite political fragmentation. The administrative innovations that had enabled Tigranes to govern diverse populations across enormous territories found new applications in managing the complex relationships between local Armenian authority and Roman imperial oversight. Officials who had coordinated provincial administration throughout a continental empire adapted their skills to negotiating the delicate balance between local autonomy and imperial subordination that characterized client kingdom status. Legal traditions that had synthesized various cultural influences evolved into distinctive Armenian jurisprudence that preserved local identity while accommodating Roman legal requirements. In the evening gatherings where families and communities processed the meaning of their transformed circumstances, the conversations that sustained morale during these challenging years revealed the depth of resilience that had always characterized Armenian culture. Stories that celebrated imperial achievements evolved into narratives that emphasized the values and character traits that had made such achievements possible. Values that remained relevant regardless of political circumstances. Cultural traditions that had flourished under imperial patronage found new expressions that drew upon community rather than royal resources while maintaining their essential character and meaning. The gradual recognition that cultural achievement could transcend political limitation created opportunities for creative expression that had been constrained by imperial responsibilities. Artists whose work had served imperial propaganda purposes found freedom to explore themes and techniques that reflected personal vision rather than political necessity. Writers whose efforts had focused on imperial chronicles discovered opportunities to explore literary traditions that reflected local rather than continental concerns, while maintaining the cosmopolitan sophistication that had characterized imperial cultural life. The religious developments that characterized the post-imperial period demonstrated how spiritual traditions could provide continuity and meaning during times of political transformation. Local deities that had been honored alongside imported spiritual traditions during the imperial period received renewed attention as sources of cultural identity that transcended political circumstances. Religious ceremonies that had incorporated elements from across the empire evolved into distinctive Armenian practices that maintained international influences while emphasizing local tradition and community identity. As the decades passed and Armenian society found stability within its transformed circumstances, the achievements of Tigranes' imperial period came to be understood not as historical curiosities, but as foundations upon which continuing cultural development could rest. The administrative skills, cultural sophistication, and international perspectives that had been developed during the imperial expansion continued to influence Armenian society long after the political structures that had originally fostered such development had disappeared. As we draw near to the end of our journey through the rise and transformation of Tigranes' empire, let us pause to contemplate the deeper currents that carry the essence of this ancient story forward through the centuries, connecting that distant mountain kingdom to our own time through threads that prove stronger than the political boundaries that rise and fall like seasons in the eternal cycle of human ambition and adaptation. The Armenia that emerged from imperial transformation possessed something more precious than territorial extent or military power. It had developed a cultural identity that could survive political subordination, economic hardship, and even systematic attempts at destruction. The synthesis of influences that had characterized Tigranes' golden age became embedded in Armenian consciousness as a approach to life that embraced diversity while maintaining distinctive character. that adapted to changing circumstances while preserving essential values. Picture, across the flowing centuries, the quiet persistence of Armenian communities that maintained their cultural traditions despite political upheavals that would have destroyed less resilient societies. In medieval monasteries perched on mountain heights that echoed with memories of ancient glory, monks preserved texts and traditions that connected their communities to the imperial achievements of their ancestors. In merchant quarters of distant cities, Armenian traders maintained commercial networks that reflected the international perspective that had characterized their people since Tigranes' time. The artistic traditions that had flourished under imperial patronage found new expressions in illuminated manuscripts that decorated sacred texts with geometric patterns and figurative representations that synthesized Christian symbolism with design elements that recalled the cultural flowering of the imperial period. Architectural techniques that had been developed for royal palaces found new applications in church construction that created worship spaces combining spiritual purpose with aesthetic achievement that honored both divine transcendence and human creativity. The musical traditions that had evolved during the imperial period through contact with diverse cultural influences continued to develop through centuries of political change, creating distinctive Armenian musical forms that maintained international sophistication while expressing local spiritual and emotional concerns. Folk songs that celebrated historical achievements evolved into cultural treasures that preserved community memory while providing entertainment and moral instruction for new generations. Yet perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Armenian cultural persistence was its ability to maintain community identity while adapting to circumstances that required geographic dispersion across enormous distances. Armenian communities established throughout the Mediterranean world, in Eastern Europe, in Central Asia, and eventually throughout the modern world, maintained cultural connections that transcended political boundaries and geographic separation, creating a form of unity that proved more durable than the territorial empire that had originally fostered such international perspective. The commercial skills that had been developed during Tigranes' expansion continued to characterize Armenian economic activity throughout subsequent centuries, enabling Armenian merchants to establish successful businesses in societies that offered opportunities for those who combined local cultural adaptation with international commercial perspective. The administrative capabilities that had enabled imperial governance found new applications in community leadership that served Armenian interests while contributing to the broader societies within which Armenian communities established themselves. In times of greatest hardship, during invasions that devastated traditional homelands, during systematic persecution that threatened cultural survival, during genocidal attempts that aimed at complete destruction of Armenian identity, the resilience that had been forged during the imperial period and tested during the post-imperial adaptation provided psychological resources that enabled survival and eventual renewal. Communities that faced complete destruction drew upon cultural traditions that had been preserved through centuries of political uncertainty, finding in their heritage sources of strength that sustained hope during the darkest periods. The educational traditions that had characterized imperial cultural achievement continued to emphasize learning and intellectual development as essential aspects of Armenian identity, creating communities that valued scholarship and cultural achievement regardless of their political circumstances. Armenian schools established throughout the world maintained educational standards that prepared young people for successful participation in modern societies, while preserving knowledge of Armenian language, history, and cultural traditions. Today, as we seek perspective on our own challenges and opportunities, the story of Tigranes and his empire offers lessons that transcend historical curiosity. In an age when global connections create both unprecedented opportunities and overwhelming complexity, the Armenian model of cultural synthesis suggests approaches to diversity that enhance rather than threaten individual identity. In times when political change occurs with bewildering rapidity, the Armenian experience of adaptation and persistence provides examples of resilience that maintains essential values while accommodating necessary change. The archaeological discoveries that continue to reveal details of daily life during Tigranes' imperial period connect us directly to people whose hopes and fears, whose ambitions and disappointments, whose loves and losses differed little from our own despite the centuries that separate us. In the foundations of buildings they constructed, in the tools they used for daily tasks, in the artistic objects that decorated their homes, we recognize the universal human desires for security, beauty, and meaning that transcend historical periods and cultural boundaries. As evening settles over our own time, as we prepare for rest that will restore our strength for tomorrow's challenges, we can find comfort in the recognition that human creativity and resilience have weathered countless storms of change and uncertainty. The empire that Tigranes built has long since passed into historical memory, but the human qualities that made such achievement possible — courage and wisdom, ambition and adaptability, individual excellence and community loyalty — remain as relevant today as they were in those distant mountain halls where kings once planned the transformation of their world. Let the story of Armenia's ancient grandeur and graceful adaptation carry you gently toward peaceful sleep, secure in the knowledge that the human capacity for achievement and survival continues to unfold in each generation, that the values which enable societies to flourish remain available to those who seek them, and that the eternal rhythms of rise and transformation will continue to provide opportunities for greatness, as long as human communities face their challenges with the courage and wisdom that enabled a Highland kingdom to astonish the ancient world and inspire the modern one. Sleep well, knowing that you are part of the continuing story of human achievement, that your own efforts to create meaning and beauty and community contribute to traditions that connect you to all who have sought to build something worthy of their highest aspirations. In the quiet darkness, the voices of ancient Armenia whisper still of possibilities that await those who dare to dream greatly while accepting gracefully the eternal truth that all human achievement finds its proper place within the larger patterns that guide the destiny of nations and the dreams of individuals toward their ultimate fulfillment in the mysterious purposes that shape our shared journey through time. In the deepening twilight of our historical journey, as the echoes of Tigranes' empire fade into the gentle whisper of mountain winds that have blown unchanged across Armenian highlands for millennia, we arrive at that sacred threshold where memory transforms into wisdom, where the particular experiences of one ancient kingdom illuminate universal truths about human aspiration and the enduring nature of cultural achievement. The story we have traced together, from the legendary origins of Artaxiad rule through the continental grandeur of Tigranes' empire to the graceful adaptation that followed imperial transformation, represents far more than the rise and fall of political boundaries. It embodies the eternal human capacity to create meaning and beauty, even within circumstances that seem to limit such creation, to find sources of strength and identity that transcend the temporal arrangements of power and territory. Consider how the essential character of Armenian civilization revealed itself most clearly not during the intoxicating years of imperial expansion, but in the quiet decades that followed political subordination. Like a river that finds its truest course not in dramatic waterfalls, but in the patient carving of canyons, Armenian culture demonstrated its deepest qualities through the persistent work of preservation and adaptation that transformed military defeat into cultural victory, territorial loss into spiritual gain. The merchant families who maintained trade networks connecting Armenian communities across continents, the scholars who preserved ancient texts in monastery libraries while developing new forms of learning adapted to changing circumstances, the artisans who continued to create objects of beauty despite the absence of imperial patronage. All participated in a form of resistance more profound than military opposition, an assertion of human dignity that proved more durable than political independence. This pattern of cultural persistence illuminates something fundamental about the nature of true achievement. The buildings that Tigranes constructed have crumbled into archaeological fragments, but the synthesis of influences that characterized his cultural policies continues to influence how Armenian communities approach diversity and adaptation. The armies that once marched from the Caspian Sea to the Mediterranean have long since returned to dust, but the administrative wisdom that enabled governance of such diverse territories continues to inform Armenian approaches to community leadership and international cooperation. In our contemporary world, where rapid change often seems to threaten cultural continuity, where global connections create both unprecedented opportunities and overwhelming complexity, the Armenian experience offers a model of resilience that maintains essential identity while embracing necessary adaptation. The same cultural flexibility that enabled highland communities to incorporate Greek learning, Persian administrative techniques, and Roman commercial practices while preserving distinctly Armenian character provides guidance for navigating modern challenges that require both local rootedness and international sophistication. The educational traditions that emerged from imperial synthesis, emphasizing multilingual competence, cultural appreciation, and adaptive problem-solving, anticipate contemporary educational approaches that prepare individuals for success in globalized societies while maintaining connection to local communities and traditions. The commercial networks that connected Armenian merchants across vast distances prefigure modern international business relationships that depend upon cultural sensitivity combined with professional competence. Yet perhaps the most profound lesson embedded in Armenia's historical experience concerns the relationship between individual ambition and collective welfare. Tigranes achieved greatness not through the pursuit of personal glory, but through service to a vision that transcended individual existence, the creation of conditions under which diverse populations could flourish while maintaining their distinctive identities. His empire succeeded because it enhanced rather than diminished the communities it incorporated, because it created opportunities for human development rather than merely extracting wealth for imperial benefit. This understanding resonates deeply with contemporary challenges that require leadership capable of thinking beyond immediate personal or organizational interests toward longer-term collective benefit. The ecological crises, social inequalities, and cultural conflicts that characterize our time demand responses that synthesize local knowledge with international perspective, that balance individual freedom with community responsibility, that honor traditional wisdom while embracing necessary innovation. The astronomical observations that guided Armenian agricultural planning, the architectural techniques that created buildings, adapted to local climate while reflecting international aesthetic influences, the legal systems that preserved local customs while enabling imperial coordination, all demonstrate approaches to complex problem-solving that remain relevant for contemporary challenges requiring similar synthesis of diverse elements into functional unity. As we prepare to conclude our journey through this ancient landscape of achievement and adaptation, let us carry forward not merely historical knowledge but practical wisdom. The story of Tigranes and his empire teaches us that true success creates conditions for others' flourishing, that genuine strength reveals itself through graceful adaptation to changing circumstances, that authentic leadership serves purposes larger than personal ambition while maintaining deep roots in local community and tradition. In the quiet moments before sleep, when the immediate pressures of daily existence yield to broader contemplation, we can find comfort in the recognition that our own efforts to create meaning and contribute to community welfare participate in traditions that connect us to all who have sought to build something worthy of their highest aspirations. The challenges we face, however daunting they may seem, are variations on eternal themes that have been addressed successfully by previous generations who possessed no resources beyond human creativity, courage, and commitment to values that transcend individual existence. The darkness that settles over our contemporary landscape carries within it the same potential for renewal that enabled Armenian communities to rebuild after every destruction, to adapt after every transformation, to continue creating beauty and meaning regardless of political circumstances. In that darkness, the voices of ancient wisdom whisper still of possibilities that await those who combine ambition with humility, strength with gentleness, local loyalty with universal compassion. Sleep peacefully, knowing that you are part of a continuing story that stretches from ancient mountain kingdoms to modern global communities, that your own contributions to human welfare and cultural development add new chapters to narratives that began in prehistoric caves and will continue as long as human communities seek to create lives of dignity, beauty, and meaning. The empire of Tigranes lives on not in territorial boundaries, but in the enduring human capacity to transform challenge into opportunity, limitation into creativity, and individual achievement into collective blessing. In the eternal silence that embraces all human striving, may you find the rest that restores strength for tomorrow's contributions to the great work of civilization that connects each generation to all others in the shared enterprise of creating a world worthy of our highest dreams and deepest values. The mountain winds that once carried the prayers of Armenian kings now carry yours toward the same eternal sources of strength and wisdom that guide all who seek to serve purposes greater than themselves, while remaining true to the communities and traditions that give their service meaning and authenticity.